Picture this. It's day 47. Your barter network has been running smoothly for 6 weeks. Food moving, skills being exchanged, trust being built one transaction at a time. And then it breaks. Marcus, your mechanic, fixed David's generator 3 weeks ago. A major repair for hours of work. The agreed trade was 2 months of preserved food from David's stockpile. David delivered 1 month, then stopped returning visits. Now Marcus is at David's door, voice raised. The food he was promised sitting somewhere inside that house while his own family supplies run thin. A crowd is forming. Not a violent crowd. Not yet, but the kind of crowd that forms when people realize, if this network fractures, everyone suffers. You're standing at the edge of that crowd. And in approximately 90 seconds, if nobody says the right thing, this dispute is going to split your community down the middle. You take 1 step forward, and you say 7 words. 7 words that nobody taught you in school. 7 words that don't appear in any law book, any contract, any negotiation manual written by anyone with a degree. 7 words that Gen X learned the hard way, through decades of disputes in garages and driveways and backyards, when there were no courts to appeal to and no authority to call. 7 words that reset the entire situation. In 60 seconds, the crowd disperses. Marcus goes home with what he needs. David's dignity is intact. The network holds. What were those 7 words? Well, to get there. But first, you need to understand why those words work. Because saying them without understanding the psychology behind them is like firing a gun without knowing how to aim. And in a post-currency community, a misfire negotiation is more dangerous than no negotiation at all. Here's what they taught you about conflict resolution. Stay calm. Listen actively. Find common ground. Seek win-win outcomes. Use I statements. You've heard this. Maybe in a corporate training. Maybe from a therapist. Maybe from a self-help book with a serene cover and a $27 price tag. And in a world with functioning institutions, a world with HR departments and civil courts and legal contracts and enforceable consequences, that framework is fine. But here's the problem. None of that works in a barter community under pressure. And I need you to understand exactly why. Because the reason is psychological, not logistical. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In a conventional conflict resolution framework, the assumption underneath every technique is that both parties have something to lose outside the relationship. Their job, their legal standing, their financial assets, their reputation in a professional network governed by institutional rules. The threat of those external losses is what keeps people at the table, what makes them willing to compromise, what gives the mediator leverage. Remove those external threats, and the entire framework collapses. In a post-currency barter community, there is no HR department, there is no civil court, there is no legal contract with enforceability, there is no external professional reputation at stake. The only thing keeping any agreement intact is the social fabric of the community itself. And social fabric, under the pressure of scarcity, fear, and unmet needs, is precisely what fractures first. So Gen X developed something different. Not a conflict resolution framework, a conflict prevention architecture, built not on rules but on psychology. And the centerpiece of that architecture, the thing that made it work when everything else failed, was a single principle that sounds almost insultingly simple when you first hear it. Stay with me. Here's the second thing they got wrong in every negotiation manual ever written for the comfortable world. They assume that conflict is about the thing being disputed, the food, the labor, the goods, the agreement that wasn't honored. It is not. Conflict in a barter community is never about the thing. It is always about the feeling underneath the thing. Marcus doesn't actually need 2 months of preserved food at this exact moment. What Marcus needs is to not feel like a fool, to not feel like his skills were taken advantage of, to not feel like the network he trusted has left him exposed. David isn't actually refusing to deliver food. David is terrified. His own supplies are lower than he admitted when he made the agreement. He is protecting his family through the only mechanism available to him, delay. 2 people in conflict, neither of them fighting about what they appear to be fighting about, and a mediator who only addresses a surface dispute, the food, the agreement, the broken promise, will solve nothing. Because the moment that surface dispute is resolved, the underlying feelings will find a new surface to erupt through. Gen X understood this not from psychology textbooks. They understood it from watching community after community fracture and noticing every time that the thing people said they were fighting about was never the actual battlefield. So what did Gen X actually build? Let me show you the architecture, because this isn't improvised. It isn't instinct. It is a precise, replicable system with 3 distinct layers, and each layer addresses a different dimension of conflict in a resource-scarce community. They didn't name it. They didn't write it down. But if you watch how Gen X handled disputes in the communities that survived intact versus the ones that fractured, the system emerges with perfect clarity. Layer 1. Prevention psychology, the techniques used before conflict erupts, the social infrastructure that reduces the frequency and intensity of disputes before they require resolution. Layer 2. Escalation protocol, the precise sequence of moves used in the first 60 to 90 seconds of an active dispute, the window when outcomes are most malleable and the crowd is still forming its impression. Layer 3. The resolution framework, the specific negotiation psychology used to reach agreements that both parties will actually honor, not because they're forced to, but because the resolution was architected to make honoring it feel like the natural outcome. And threading through all 3 layers, the principle that makes every technique work, is something Gen X called informally the dignity principle. The dignity principle is the master key. It is the reason those 7 words work. It is the reason some mediators could walk into any dispute and reliably resolve it, while others, using all the right textbook language, made things worse every single time. And once you understand it, you will never approach a conflict the same way again. Not in a survival scenario, not in a boardroom, not in a marriage. Here's what it actually is. Every human being, regardless of what they have done, regardless of whether they are right or wrong in a dispute, has one non-negotiable psychological need that overrides every other consideration: the need to exit any situation without feeling diminished, not the need to win, not the need to be right, not the need to get everything they asked for, the need to walk away with their sense of self intact. This sounds soft. It is not. In a post-currency community where social standing is a survival resource, where reputation functions as credit, where being seen as weak or foolish or a pushover is a genuine security threat, the need to exit without feeling diminished is not a psychological preference. It is a survival drive. And any conflict resolution approach that ignores it, that forces someone to capitulate publicly, that makes someone admit fault in front of the community, that resolves the surface dispute while demolishing the loser's dignity, has not resolved the conflict. It has deferred it, compressed it, and guaranteed a more explosive eruption later. Gen X built every conflict technique around one central question: how do we reach a real resolution while ensuring that both parties exit with their dignity fully intact? The answer to that question, across decades of community disputes in garages, in driveways, and backyards, produced the system we are about to walk through. Here is the uncomfortable truth about most barter disputes. They were preventable, not because people are bad, not because scarcity makes people selfish, though it does, but because the agreements that generated the disputes were built on assumptions that both parties held privately and never articulated. Marcus assumed 2 months of food meant 2 months of equal quality food delivered in equal monthly portions. David assumed 2 months of food was a general commitment that could flex based on his available supply at any given time. Both assumptions were completely reasonable. Neither was ever spoken out loud. This is a fundamental architecture of every preventable barter dispute ever recorded. 2 reasonable people. 2 unspoken assumptions. 1 agreement. Gen X's first prevention tool was brutally simple. Before any significant barter agreement is finalized, both parties are required, by social norm in a healthy barter community, to state their assumptions out loud, not to negotiate, not to argue, just to state. When I say 2 months of preserved food, I mean approximately this quantity, this quality, delivered in these intervals. When I agree to 2 months of preserved food, I am committing to the specific amount delivered regardless of my supply fluctuations. Takes 60 seconds. Prevents approximately 70% of all barter disputes before they begin. Gen X normalizes not through rules, but through modeling. The respected members of the community did it. And because they did it, and because their agreements reliably held, others followed. This is how cultural norms spread without enforcement, through demonstrated success. But here's the prevention tool that goes even deeper, and this one is genuinely counterintuitive. It involves deliberately building a small amount of failure into every significant barter agreement, on purpose. And the communities that did this had dramatically lower conflict rates than the ones that demanded perfect compliance. Here's the psychology behind why. In every significant barter agreement, Gen X communities embedded what they called informally a graceful exit clause, not written, not legalistic, just spoken at the end of the agreement. Something like, and if either of us hits a wall and can't deliver exactly what we promised, we come to each other first, before it becomes a problem. No judgment, 6 words that change everything. We come to each other first. This clause did 3 things simultaneously. First, acknowledge that circumstances change, that in a disrupted world, perfect compliance is not always possible. This acknowledgement alone reduced the shame associated with coming forward with a problem, which meant people came forward before the problem became a dispute. Second, it established a communication obligation before the problem escalated to community visibility. The dispute stayed private and solvable as long as both parties honored the clause. Third, it created a social norm around proactive communication that, over time, became the community's most powerful conflict prevention mechanism. Because a community where people habitually say, I have a problem, let's solve it before it explodes, has a fundamentally different conflict frequency than one where problems are hidden until they erupt. David never came to Marcus because nobody had ever told David that coming to Marcus early was the right move. Nobody had built a graceful exit clause into their agreement. That one omission turned a solvable problem into a community crisis. For any barter agreement of significant value, a third member of the community is present as a witness, not a judge, not an authority. A witness. Their role is not to enforce the agreement. Their role is simply to remember it, and to be the person both parties can approach privately if problems arise before they become public disputes. The presence of a witness does 2 things. First, it makes both parties more precise about what they are actually agreeing to, because they are stating it in front of someone who will remember. Second, it creates a private mediation channel before the dispute goes public. Instead of Marcus confronting David at his door with a crowd forming, Marcus goes quietly to the witness first. The witness makes a private approach to David. The problem has a chance to resolve in private before it requires public confrontation. In communities that use the agreement witness consistently, the percentage of private resolutions versus public disputes was dramatically higher. Because most people, when given a private path to resolution that preserves their dignity, take it. The first 60 seconds. The window that determines everything. When prevention fails, and sometimes it does, the first 60 seconds of an active dispute are the most critical. Not because that's when the dispute is resolved, because that's when the crowd forms its narrative. In a barter community, the community's perception of dispute is as important as the dispute itself, because the community's perception determines which party has social capital and which party loses it, regardless of who is technically right. A mediator who walks into an active dispute and immediately takes a position, even the correct position, has already lost, because half the crowd will now defend the other side purely out of social loyalty. And a dispute has become a proxy for community politics rather than a resolvable disagreement between 2 people. Gen X mediators understood this with total precision. Their first 60 seconds followed a specific sequence. The mediator does not walk to either party. The mediator walks to the exact physical center point between the 2 parties and stops. This is not symbolic. It is neurological. The human brain reads physical positioning as alignment. A mediator who stands closer to one party, even by 2 feet, is unconsciously read by the crowd as aligned with that party. Center positioning signals neutrality before a single word is spoken, before addressing either party in the dispute. The mediator makes brief, warm eye contact with 3 or 4 members of the crowd, not speaking to them, not acknowledging the dispute, just making human contact with the observers. This does something precise. It brings the crowd's nervous system down. A crowd watching a conflict is in a state of elevated arousal, fight or flight adjacent. Direct eye contact from a calm, centered person is neurologically regulating. The crowd's collective tension drops by measurable degrees in the 10 seconds of this move. A calmer crowd is a less reactive crowd. A less reactive crowd gives the mediator more space to work. The mediator says both parties' names. Separately, calmly, with equal warmth. Marcus, a beat, David. Not Marcus and David. Separately, because saying names separately gives each person a moment of individual acknowledgement. A micro-signal that says you are seen as an individual, not just a side in a dispute. This is the first application of the dignity principle. Before a single substantive word has been spoken, this is where the mediator says the sentence that matters most in the de-escalation phase, not the 7 words. Those come later. This is a different sentence, the one that compresses the entire dispute into a frame that both parties can accept before resolution begins. The compression statement sounds like this. 2 people who both kept their word to this community are having a hard conversation. Let's have it right. Parse this carefully, because every word is doing precise psychological work. 2 people who both kept their word to this community. This is not true yet in the dispute. Marcus believes David broke his word, but the mediator is not describing the past. The mediator is establishing the identity of both parties as community members who keep their word, making a resolution that honors that identity the path of least resistance. Are having a hard conversation reframes a dispute as a conversation rather than a conflict. Conversations have participants. Conflicts have opponents. The reframe is instant and powerful. Let's have it right. The word right does enormous work here. It implies that there's a right way to have this conversation, and that the mediator knows what it is, and that both parties are capable of it. It is an invitation to competence rather than a warning against failure. In 60 seconds, no position taken, no judgment made, no side chosen. The mediator has physically centered the situation, neurologically regulated the crowd, individually acknowledged both parties, and reframed the entire dispute from conflict to conversation. Now the real work begins. And here is where Gen X negotiation psychology diverges most sharply from everything you've ever been taught about conflict resolution. Because the next move, the one that determines whether the resolution actually holds, involves doing something that every instinct in your body will tell you is wrong. It involves deliberately making the dispute worse before making it better. Here's exactly why, and exactly how, the psychology of agreements that actually hold. Every conventional conflict resolution approach tries to minimize the dispute as quickly as possible. Get to the solution, get to the agreement, get to the handshake, end the discomfort. Gen X mediators did the opposite. They expanded the dispute first, not by escalating it, not by adding fuel, but by drawing out the full emotional reality of both parties before attempting any resolution. Because here is a psychological truth that makes this counterintuitive move so powerful. An agreement reached before both parties feel fully heard is not an agreement. It is a postponement. The party whose emotional reality was not fully acknowledged will honor the letter of the agreement, if they honor it all, while nursing a grievance that will find its outlet in the next dispute, and the one after that, and the one after that. You have not resolved a conflict until both parties feel that what they actually experienced, not just what they said they wanted, but what they felt, has been witnessed and validated by someone with standing in the community. Gen X called this, in their informal language, emptying the cup. You cannot fill a cup that is already full. You cannot build agreement in a person who is still full of unacknowledged feeling. So the first move in the resolution phase is not toward agreement. It is toward emptying. The mediator turns to the party most visibly activated, in this case Marcus, and asks one specific question. Not what happened, not what do you want, not what did David agree to. The question is, Marcus, what did this cost you? This question is a masterpiece of psychological precision. What did this cost you? Goes immediately beneath the surface dispute to the actual experience. Marcus doesn't just answer with food quantities. He answers with what the broken agreement actually meant, the worry, the feeling of being taken advantage of, the fear for his family, the damage to his trust in the network. The mediator listens, completely, without interruption, without note-taking, without the body language of waiting to respond, just receiving. When Marcus finishes, The mediator does not respond to the content, does not evaluate it, does not agree or disagree. The mediator says one sentence. I heard that. 2 words. Enormous power. Because I heard that is not agreement. It is not validation of Marcus's position. It is not judgment of David. It is pure acknowledgement. The most powerful thing a human being can receive in a moment of pain. Marcus's nervous system drops. His cup has been emptied by approximately half. Then the mediator turns to David. David, what did this cost you? David's answer surprises the crowd, because David is not defiant. David is terrified. His own supplies are lower than he admitted. He made an agreement he genuinely intended to honor and found himself unable to without risking his family. The crowd, which had formed a narrative of David as the villain, shifts, not to defending David, but to a more complex understanding, the kind of understanding that makes resolution possible. The mediator receives David's answer with the same complete attention. I heard that. Now both cups are empty. Now both parties have been witnessed. Now and only now is resolution actually possible. And here is where those 7 words appear. The sentence that functioned as a universal reset in almost every barter conflict ever documented in Gen X communities. I'm going to give it to you now, but I need you to understand something first. The sentence only works because of everything that came before it. Used without the emptying sequence, without the de-escalation protocol, without the dignity principle. It is just words. With them, it is a resolution itself. Here it is. The mediator looks at both parties, equidistant, centered, having heard both, and says, what would make this right going forward? 7 words. Parse them carefully, because every word is load-bearing. What opens possibility, invites invention rather than demanding capitulation to a predetermined solution, would make conditional future-facing, not what should have happened, which is backward-facing and blame-adjacent. What would make is entirely forward. The past is acknowledged but not relitigated. The dispute is named without being characterized. Not this mess or this problem or this situation. Just this, neutral, present, right, the most powerful word in the sentence. Because right invokes an internal moral standard that both parties already share. The mediator is not imposing a standard. The mediator is invoking the standard that already exists inside both parties and asking them to apply it. Going forward, the temporal anchor. Resolution lives in the future. The past is closed. The community continues. What happens next is what matters. The genius of this sentence is that it does not require the mediator to have a solution. It requires the parties to generate the solution. And solutions generated by the parties themselves, not imposed by an authority, are honored at dramatically higher rates. Because the party who generates their own solution has no one to blame for it, no external imposition to resent, no authority to undermine by non-compliance. They built the resolution. They own it. They honor it. Marcus answers first. His answer, having had his cup emptied, is not the maximalist demand of a man in full grievance. It is a genuine answer of a man whose pain has been witnessed. I need the rest of what David promised, and I need to know the network is solid. David answers. His answer, having had his fear witnessed, is not the defensive retreat of a man protecting himself from blame. It is a genuine answer of a man who wants to restore what he damaged. I can deliver half next week and the rest the week after. And I'll let people know when I'm running low before I agree anything I can't honor. The mediator says nothing. The crowd says nothing. Because what just happened, 2 people generating a resolution that addresses both the surface dispute and the underlying fears, is a community working exactly as it is supposed to work. The mediator's final move is simple. Does that work for both of you? Marcus nods. David nods. The mediator says the last sentence, and this one matters too. Then this is finished. Not problem solved. Not good job. Not any language that requires either party to perform gratitude or relief. Just, this is finished. The dispute is closed. The community moves forward. Both parties exit with their dignity intact. The network holds. Let's make this practical, because everything you just learned is only valuable if you can use it. The Gen X negotiation protocol. A complete framework you can implement immediately. Phase 1, before any significant agreement. Apply the 3 prevention tools without exception. State your assumptions out loud. Both parties, before the agreement is finalized. 60 seconds that prevents 70% of all disputes. Embed the graceful exit clause in every agreement. If either of us hits a wall, we come to each other first. 6 words. Non-negotiable. Identify a witness for any agreement of significant value. Non-authority. A trusted community member who remembers and can facilitate privately before the dispute goes public. Phase 2. The moment a dispute begins. The first 60 seconds are yours to win or lose. Move to the center, not toward either party. The exact center. Regulate the crowd with eye contact before speaking. 3 to 4 people. Calm, warm, brief. Acknowledge both names separately, with equal warmth, before any substantive word. Deliver compression statement. 2 people who both kept their word to this community are having a hard conversation. Let's have it right. Phase 3, the emptying sequence. Ask the most activated party, what did this cost you? Receive completely. No interruption. No body language of response preparation. Say, I heard that. Ask the second party, what did this cost you? Receive completely. Say, I heard that. Do not move to resolution until both cups are empty. You will feel the shift when it happens. The room temperature changes. The body language opens. The audience exhales. Phase 4, the resolution sentence. When both cups are empty, and only then, deliver the 7 words. What would make this right going forward? Receive both answers without evaluation. Let the parties negotiate the specifics between themselves. Your role as mediator is now to hold the space, not to fill it. When they reach their own resolution, confirm it with, does that work for both of you? Close with, then this is finished. Phase 5, the post-resolution move. This phase is almost universally skipped. It is one of the most important. Within 24 hours of any significant dispute resolution, the mediator makes a private visit to each party separately, not to discuss the dispute, not to check compliance, just to show up. How are you doing? That's the entire visit. This move does something the resolution itself cannot do. It signals that the relationship between the mediator and each party is not contingent on the dispute being over, that the care is ongoing, not transactional. This signal, more than the resolution itself, is what rebuilds the trust between the disputing parties over the following days, because each party knows the mediator checked on them privately, and each party suspects correctly that the mediator checked on the other party too. The knowledge that both parties were treated with equal private care after the dispute is the final act of the dignity principle, and it transforms a resolved dispute into a strengthened relationship. Now, you understand the single dispute resolution framework. You have the 7 words. You have the protocol. You have the prevention tools. And if barter conflicts were always 2-party disputes, you would be fully equipped. But here's what nobody tells you. The most dangerous conflicts in a post-currency community are not 2-party disputes. They are network-level fractures, and they operate on completely different psychology. A 2-party dispute is Marcus and David, isolated, contained, resolvable with the framework you now have. A network-level fracture is what happens when a dispute stops being about 2 people and starts being about what kind of community this is. It happens when a dispute triggers existing fault lines. When people who were never part of the original agreement start taking sides. When the conflict becomes a proxy for deeper disagreements about values, fairness, leadership, and belonging. And here is what makes network-level fractures so dangerous. By the time you recognize one, it has usually been building for weeks. The visible eruption is not the beginning. It is the end stage of a long underground process. And the tools that resolve 2-party disputes, the emptying sequence, the 7 words, the dignity principle, are necessary but not sufficient for a network-level fracture. Because in a network-level fracture, the mediator is no longer outside the conflict. The mediator is part of it. Everyone is part of it. And the psychology of resolution at that level requires something Gen X developed specifically for communities under existential pressure, a framework they called, informally, the reckoning. The reckoning is the most advanced technique in the entire Gen X conflict architecture. It has never been formalized. It has never been written down, but it has saved more communities from permanent fracture than any other single practice. And there is a specific trigger, a specific moment in a community's deterioration, when the reckoning must happen or the network is lost. Here is what that trigger looks like, and what the reckoning actually involves. The trigger for the reckoning is precise. Watch for it. When 3 or more disputes occur within the same community within a 30-day period, and when those disputes share a common underlying theme, even if the surface issues are different, the community is not experiencing a series of isolated conflicts. It is experiencing a single systemic failure expressed through multiple surface events. Treating each dispute separately, as individual two-party conflicts, will exhaust the community's mediation capacity and solve nothing, because the root is not in any of the individual disputes. The root is in an unspoken community-level disagreement about something fundamental, usually one of three things: fairness in contribution, the unspoken belief, held by a significant portion of the community, that some members are taking more than they are giving, that the exchange is not balanced, that the network is being exploited by some at the expense of others. Leadership legitimacy, the unspoken question of who has the right to make decisions, set norms, and resolve disputes. When this is unresolved, every decision by every informal leader generates a faction that resents it. Membership boundaries, who is in the network and who is not, who deserves access to its resources and protections. This question, almost always unspoken, generates the most explosive conflicts when it finally surfaces. The reckoning addresses whichever of these three roots is driving the surface disputes, and it requires one thing that no other conflict technique requires: a community meeting where the unspoken thing is spoken out loud, not in accusation, not in blame, but in a specific, courageous act of a respected community member standing up and naming the thing everyone is thinking and nobody is saying. We have had 3 disputes this month, and I think they're all about the same thing. I think some of us feel the exchange is not fair. I think we need to talk about that directly before it tears us apart. The naming alone, the act of bringing the underground river to the surface, releases pressure that has been building for weeks. And from that named starting point, the reckoning proceeds through its own version of the emptying sequence, applied at community scale. Not 2 cups, many cups, emptied one at a time, in a space where the dignity principle is enforced not by a single mediator, but by the community norm itself. It takes hours, sometimes a full day, and the communities that did it, that had the courage to call a reckoning when the trigger appeared, emerged stronger, more cohesive, and more resilient than they were before the fracture began. The communities that avoided it, that kept treating the surface disputes individually and hoped the underlying rot would resolve itself, did not survive intact. Let's end with what this is really about, because it's not really about barter disputes. It's not really about 7 words or de-escalation sequences or community meetings. It's about what holds human beings together when the systems that usually hold them together are gone. And the answer that Gen X discovered not through theory but through living, is not complicated. What holds human beings together is a consistent, deliberate, practiced act of making every person they interact with feel that their experience matters. That is the dignity principle in its most distilled form, not agreement, not compliance, not the enforcement of rules. The simple, radical, daily act of making people feel seen. Marcus didn't need 2 months of food as much as he needed to know that his labor mattered, that the community saw what he contributed and would not allow it to be taken without acknowledgement. David didn't need to be forgiven as much as he needed to know that his fear, the fear of a father who couldn't deliver what he promised because his family's survival was at stake, was a human response that the community could hold without judgment. 7 words open the space for both of those truths to be honored simultaneously. What would make this right going forward? That question, in its deceptive simplicity, contains everything. It contains respect for both parties' intelligence. It contains trust in human beings' capacity to resolve their own conflicts when given the right conditions. It contains a forward orientation of community that intends to survive, that is more interested in the next chapter than in relitigating the last one. And it contains a dignity principle in its purest form. The belief that both people in any conflict, however they got there, deserve to exit the situation as full human beings. Gen X didn't read this in a book. They learned it at kitchen tables and in garages and in backyards. They learned the way all the most important things get learned, through the specific, irreplaceable education of being in the room when things went wrong, and watching what the right person said and did to make them right again. That person, in community after community, in crisis after crisis, was rarely the loudest, rarely the strongest, rarely the most resourced. They were the person who understood that every conflict is a human being asking, in the only language available to them at that moment, "Do I matter here?" And who knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had answered that question many times before, exactly what to say. 7 words. What would make this right going forward? Now you carry them too. In the next video, we go to the level that almost nobody survives. What happens when the conflict isn't between 2 members of your community, but between your community and an outside group that wants what you've built? The negotiation psychology changes completely. The stakes change completely. And the single most dangerous mistake that prepared communities make, the one that has ended more survival networks than any external threat, is something so counterintuitive that most people refuse to believe it until it's too late. If you want to be there for that, you know what to do.